An Amiable Charlatan by E. Phillips, Oppenheim. The thing happened so suddenly that I really had very little time to make up my mind what course to adopt under somewhat singular circumstances. I was seated at my favorite table against the wall, on the right hand side in Stephano's restaurant, with a newspaper propped up before me, a glass of hock by my side, and a portion of the plat du jour, which happened to be chicken en casserole, on the plate in front of me. I was, in fact, halfway through dinner when, without a word of warning, a man who seemed to enter with a light-footed speed removed with smooth and marvelous haste to his vicinity. Under cover of the tablecloth a packet, I could not tell what it contained, was thrust into my hand. "Sir," he said, raising my glass of wine to his lips, "kindly accept the situation." I stared at him for a moment quite blankly. Then I recognized him, and transferring at once the packet to my trousers pocket, I drew another glass toward me and poured out the remainder of my half bottle of hock. So much, at any rate, I felt I had saved. "I shall offer you presently," my self-invited guest continued, with his mouth full of my chicken, "the fullest explanation. I shall also ask you to do me the honor of dining with me. I think I am right in saying that we are not altogether strangers." "I know you very well by sight," I told him. "I have seen you here several times before, with a young lady." "Exactly," he agreed. "My daughter, sir." "Then, for the sake of your daughter," I said, "witness or guest, you are very welcome to sit at my table. As for this packet " "Keep it for a few moments, my young friend," the newcomer interrupted, "just while I recover my breath, that is all. Have confidence in me. Things may happen here very shortly. Sit tight and you will never regret it. My name, so far as you are concerned, is Joseph H. Parker. Tell me, you are facing the door, some one has just entered. Who is it?" "A stranger," I replied. "A stranger to this place, I am sure. He is tall and dark. He is a little lantern jawed, a hatchet-shaped face, I should call it." "My man, right enough," Mr. Joseph H. Parker muttered. "Don't seem to notice him particularly," he added. "But tell me what he is doing." "He seems to have entered in a hurry," I announced, "and is now taking off his overcoat. He is wearing, I perceive, a bowler hat, a dinner jacket, the wrong shaped collar, and he appears to have forgotten to change his boots." "That's Cullen all right," Mr. Joseph H. Parker groaned. "You're a person of observation, sir. Well, I've been in tighter corners than this. Thanks to you." "Who is Mr. Cullen, and what does he want?" I asked. "Mr. Cullen," my guest declared, sampling the fresh bottle of wine which had just been brought to him, "is one of those misguided individuals whose lack of faith in his fellows will bring him some time or other to a bad end. My young friend, sip that wine thoughtfully, don't hurry over it, and tell me whether my choice is not better than yours." "Possibly," I remarked, with a glance at the yellow seal, "your pocket is longer. By the by, your friend is coming toward us." "It is not a question of pocket," Mr. Parker continued, disregarding my remark. "It is a question of taste and judgment. Discrimination is perhaps the word I should use. Now, in my younger days what's that?" The person named Cullen had paused at my table. His hand was resting gently upon the shoulder of my self-invited guest. Mr. Parker looked up and appeared to recognize him with much surprise. "You, my dear fellow!" he exclaimed. "Say, I am delighted to see you, I am sure. But would you mind just a little lower with your fingers? Too professional a touch altogether." Mr. Cullen smiled, and from that moment I took a dislike to him, a dislike that did much toward determining the point of view from which I was inclined to consider various succeeding incidents. He was by no means a person of prepossessing appearance. His cheeks were colorless save for a sort of yellowish tinge. His mouth reminded me of the mouth of a horse. His teeth were irregular and poor. Yet there was about the man a certain sense of power. His eyes were clear and bright. His manner was imbued with the reserve strength of a man who knows his own mind and does not fear to speak it. "I am sorry to interrupt you at your dinner, Mr. Parker," he said, his eyes traveling all over the table as though taking in its appointments and condition. "Of no consequence at all," Mr. Parker assured him. "In fact, I have nearly finished. If you are thinking of dining here, let me recommend this chicken en casserole. I have tasted nothing so good for days." Mr. Cullen thanked him mechanically. His mind, however, was obviously filled with other things. He was puzzled. "You must have a double about this evening, I fancy," he remarked. "I could have sworn I saw you coming out of a certain little house in Adam Street not a couple of minutes ago. You know the little house I mean." Mr. Parker smiled. "Seems as though that double were all right," he said. "I am halfway through my dinner, as you can see, and I'm a slow eater, especially in pleasant company. Shake hands with my friend, Mr. Paul Walmsley, Mr. Cullen." My surprise for my companion's complete and absolute assurance. Mr. Cullen and I exchanged a perfunctory handshake, which left me without any change in my feelings toward him. "Another of my mistakes, I suppose," Mr. Cullen said quietly. "Of a few moments only. I won't even suggest Bow Street at present. If you could take a stroll with me, even into Luigi's office would do." Mr. Parker put down his knife and fork with a little gesture of irritation. His broad, good-straighted, "Don't you think you're carrying this a bit too far, you know? There isn't a man and I'm afraid that I am not at liberty to study your comfort." Mr. Parker sighed heavily. "Do you mind, Walmsley, having my plate marked?" as he rose to his feet. "Mr. Cullen wants a word or two with me in private, and Mr. Cullen is a man who will have his own way." I nodded as indifferently as possible, and the two men walked off together toward the entrance. Then I summoned my waiter. "Bring me," I ordered, "a fresh portion of chicken, and order some asparagus to follow. Keep my friend's chicken warm, and order him some asparagus also." Leaning back in my chair, I tried to puzzle out the probable meaning of this somewhat extraordinary happening. My acquiescence in the attitude that had been so suddenly forced upon me was owing entirely to one circumstance. Mr. Joseph H. Parker I had recognized at his first entrance as a regular habitué of the restaurant. He was usually accompanied by a young lady who, from the first moment I had seen her, had produced an effect upon my not too susceptible disposition for which I was wholly unable to account, but which was the sole reason why I had given up my club and all other restaurants and occupied that particular place for the last fortnight. I had put the two down as an American and his daughter traveling in England for pleasure, and my continual presence at the restaurant was wholly inspired by the hope that some opportunity might arise by means of which I could make their acquaintance. Adventures, in the ordinary sense of the word, had never appealed to me in admiration. The opportunity I desired had now apparently come. I had made the acquaintance of Mr. Joseph H. Parker, made it in an unceremonious manner, perhaps, but still under circumstances that would probably result in his being willing to acknowledge himself my debtor. I had a packet of something belonging to him in my pocket, which was presumably valuable. His friend Mr. Cullen I detested, and the reference to Bow Street puzzled me. However, I had no doubt that in a few minutes everything would be explained. Meantime, I permitted myself to indulge in certain very pleasurable anticipations. In the course of about a quarter of an hour Mr. Joseph H. Parker reappeared. He came down the room humming a tune, and apparently quite pleased with himself. I took the opportunity of studying his personal appearance a little more closely. He was not tall, but he was distinctly fat. He had a large double chin, but a certain freshness of complexion and massiveness about his forehead relieved his face from any suspicious plentiful eyebrows. His iron gray hair was brushed carefully back from his forehead. He smiled contentedly as he seated himself once more at my table. "Really," he began, "I scarcely know how to excuse myself, Mr. Walmsley. However, thanks to you, we can now dine in comfort. Until now I fear I have taken your good offices very much for granted, but I assure you it will give me the greatest pleasure to make your closer acquaintance and to impress upon you my extreme sense of obligation." "You are very kind," I replied. "By the by, might I ask how you know my name?" "My young friend," Mr. Parker said, eyeing with approval the fresh portion of chicken that had been brought him, "it is my business to know many things. I go about the world with my eyes and ears open. Things that escape other people interest me. Your name is Mr. Paul Walmsley. You are one of a class of men that practically doesn't exist in America. You have no particular occupation that I know of, save that you have a small estate in the country, which no doubt takes up some of your time. You have rooms in London, which you occupy occasionally. You probably write a little. I have noticed that you are fond of watching people." "You really seem to know a good deal about me," I confessed, a little taken aback. "I am not far from the mark, am I?" "You are not," I admitted. "As regards your lack of occupation, ordinary routine of the professions, and the ordinary curriculum of business life is a species of slavery. We live in over civilized times. There seems to be very little room anywhere for a man to gratify his natural instincts for change and adventure." I murmured my acquiescence with his sentiments, and my companion paused for a few minutes, his whole attention devoted to his dinner. "You are an American, are you not?" "I am most certainly an American," Mr. Parker assented. "In business?" I asked. Mr. Parker looked round. Our table was comparatively isolated. "I am an adventurer," he replied mysteriously. I stared at him and repeated the word. "My daughter, whom you have seen here with me, is an adventuress. We live by our wits, and we do pretty well at it. Sometimes we live in luxury, sometimes we are up against it good and hard. The Ritz one day, you know, and Bloomsbury the next. But lots of fun all the time." I looked at him a little blankly. "To a certain extent I suppose you are joking?" I asked. "To no extent at all," he assured me. "By the by, as regards that packet, would you mind just slipping it under this newspaper?" I withdrew it from my pocket and obeyed him at once. Mr. Parker's fingers seemed to play with it for a moment, and I noticed at that moment what a strong and capable hand he seemed to have, with fingers of unusual length and suppleness. A dark faced maître d'hôtel, who presided over our portion of the room, came up smiling, with an inquiry as to our coffee. He exchanged a casual sentence or two with Mr. Parker, bowed, and passed on. Mr. Parker, a moment later, with a little smile, lifted the newspaper. The packet had disappeared. He noticed my look of surprise and seemed gratified. "A mere trifle, that," he declared. "I can assure you that I could have taken it out of your pocket if I had desired, without your feeling a thing." "Wonderful!" I murmured, feeling distinctly uncomfortable. "Just a gift," he continued modestly. I was beginning to think rapidly now. "By the by," I asked, "what is Mr. Cullen's profession?" "He is a detective," Mr. Parker announced, without hesitation, "and to my mind a singularly bad one. For 2 months he has had what they call his eye on me. Between ourselves, I think he will have his eye on me still in another 2 months' time. I am sure I hope so, for I frankly admit that half the savor of life would be gone if my friend Mr. Cullen were to finally give me up. Feeling was reflected in my face. I had always considered myself a man of the world, and I was interested enough in my fellows to enjoy mixing with all classes. But there was the girl. "You are thinking?" my companion began softly. "Your friend," I interrupted, "has just entered the restaurant. He is coming toward this table." Mr. Parker's expression never changed. Not a muscle twitched. His tone was even careless. "Just as well, perhaps," he remarked, "that we worked that little conjuring trick." The detective stood once more at our table. My instinctive dislike of him was now an accomplished thing. I hated his smile of subdued triumph, and all my fundamental ideas as to law and order were seriously affected by it. I was distinctly on the side of my new acquaintance. "I am sorry to interrupt this little feast," Mr. Cullen said, "but I shall have to trouble you both to come with me for a short time." Mr. Parker carefully clipped the end of his cigar and leaned back in his chair while he lit it. "My friend Cullen," he remonstrated, "I have no objection to offering myself up as a victim to your superabundant energy and trotting about with you wherever you choose, but when it comes to dragging my friends into it, a little too far, sir." "If either of you seriously object to my request," Mr. Cullen replied doggedly, "I can put the matter on a different basis." "Who is this friend of yours, and why should we go anywhere with him?" I asked. Mr. Parker shook his head mournfully. You may well ask," he sighed. "You may not think it, to look at his ingenuous and honest expression, but the fact nevertheless remains that Mr. Cullen is a misguided but zealous member of the Sherlock Holmes fraternity in short, a detective." I rose to my feet with some alacrity. "Anything in the shape of an adventure " I began. "Not much adventure about this," Mr. Parker interrupted gloomily, brushing the ashes from his waistcoat and also rising. "We are probably going to be searched for spoons. However, if it must be " For the first time in my life I walked side by side with a detective. He led us to the far end of the restaurant into an apartment usually used by the manager as a wine tasting office, and carefully closed the door behind us. Outside I caught the glimmer of a policeman's helmet. "Every precaution taken, you perceive," Mr. Parker remarked. "In case we should turn out to be desperate characters, and appalled by the fear of discovery should be driven to make a personal attack upon Mr. Cullen, a myrmidon of the law is lurking near. Under those circumstances I shall eschew violence. I shall submit myself peaceably to a second examination." I found the affair on the whole interesting. I divested myself only of my coat and waistcoat, and Mr. Cullen's fingers did the rest. Only a single and momentary frown betrayed his disappointment, as 10 minutes later he unlocked the door. "Gentlemen," he said, "I owe you my most profound apologies." "That's all right, Cullen," Mr. Parker observed, patting him on the shoulder. "But let's have this thing straight now. Are we to be allowed to finish our dinner in peace, or will you be turning up again with a new idea? And if I take a box for the Tivoli presently, shall we have the pleasure of seeing you bob in upon us?" "So far as my present intentions are concerned," Mr. Cullen remarked grimly, "you," turning to me, "to have been the cause of any annoyance to you this evening. My advice to you is, if you wish to escape these inconveniences through life, to avoid the society of people whose character is known to the police." "I shall get you for libel yet, Cullen," Mr. Parker declared, pulling down his waistcoat. "What I've done to annoy that man I can't imagine," he went on impersonally. "Mind, he practises on me I'm convinced of it." Mr. Cullen left us abruptly and quitted the restaurant. I returned to our table with my new friend. "Really," he said, "I scarcely know how to apologize to you, Mr. Walmsley. This sort of thing amuses me as a rule, but I must admit that Mr. Cullen is apt to get on one's nerves. A well meaning man, mind, but unduly persistent." I resumed my seat at the table. I was feeling a little dazed. Keeping, I felt sure that packet had gone. Seated by my side was the gentleman who had assured me with the utmost self possession that he was an adventurer, and standing in the doorway looking at us was the girl who for the last few weeks had monopolized herself even among the outcasts of the world. Chapter 2 The Coup in the Gambling Den On seeing us the girl advanced into the room. I called Mr. Parker's attention to her, and he rose at once to his feet. It was a cold evening in April, and she was wearing a long coat trimmed with some dark colored fur, and a hat also trimmed with fur, but with something blue in it. She was rather tall, she had masses of dark brown hair, a suspicion of a fringe, and deep blue eyes. She came toward us very deliberately, with the same grace of movement I had watched and admired night after night. She gave me a glance of the slightest possible curiosity as she approached. Then her father introduced us. "This is Mr. Paul Walmsley, my dear," he said. "My daughter. Have you dined, Eve?" She shook hands with me and smiled very charmingly. "Hours ago," she replied. "I didn't mean to come out this evening, but I was so bored that I thought I would try and find you." She accepted a chair I was holding and unbuttoned her cloak. "You will have some coffee?" I begged. "Why, that would be delightful," she agreed. "I am so glad to find you with my father, Mr. Walmsley," she continued. "I know he hates dining alone, but this evening I had an appointment with a dressmaker quite late, and I didn't feel a bit like dinner anyhow." "You come here often, don't you?" I ventured. "Very often indeed," she replied. "You see, it is not in the least entertaining where we are staying, and the cooking is abominable. Then father adores "The truth," Mr. Parker remarked, lighting another cigar. "My daughter knows that I speak nothing else. It is a weakness of mine. Mr. Walmsley and I were exchanging and adventurous. I think by now he is beginning to believe it." She laughed very softly, almost under her breath. Yet I fancied there was a note of mockery in her mirth. "Confess that you were very much shocked, Mr. Walmsley," she said. "Not in the least," I assured her. She raised her eyebrows ever so respectable people before. "How do you know," I asked, "that my life has been well ordered?" "Look at yourself in the glass," she begged. Scarcely knowing what I did, I turned round in my seat and obeyed her. There is perhaps a strand of my fondness for outdoor sports. My hair is straight and I have never grown beard or mustache. I felt somehow that I represented the things which in an Englishman are a little derided by young ladies on the other side of the water. "I can't help my appearance," I said, a little crossly. "I can assure you that I am not a prig." "Our young friend," Mr. Parker intervened, "has certainly earned his immunity from any such title. To tell you the truth, Eve, he has already been my accomplice this evening in a certain little matter. But for his help, who knows that I might not have found myself up against it? Between us we have even had a little fun out of Cullen." Her expression changed. She seemed, for some reason, none too well pleased. "What have you been doing?" she asked me. "I, personally, have been doing very little indeed," I told her. "Your father entered the restaurant in a hurry about an hour ago and found it convenient to seat himself at my table and help himself to my dinner. He entrusted me, also, with a packet, which I subsequently returned to him." "It is now," Mr. Parker declared, replying to his daughter's anxious glance, "in perfectly safe hands." She sighed and shook her head at him. "Daddy," she murmured plaintively, "why will you run such risks? Even Mr. Cullen isn't an absolute idiot, you know, and there might have been some one else watching." Mr. Parker nodded. "You are quite right, my dear," he admitted. "To tell you the truth, Cullen was really a little smarter than usual this evening. However, there's always the luck, you know our luck. If Mr. Walmsley had turned out a different sort of man but then I knew he wouldn't." She turned her head and looked at me. She had a trick of contracting the corners of her eyes just a little, which was absolutely bewitching. "Will you tell me why you helped my father in this way, Mr. Walmsley?" I returned her repulse after I had recognized him. She smiled a little. My speech failing regularity. "What about a music hall?" Mr. Parker suggested. Walmsley. "None at all," I hastened to assure him. We left the play, however. Mr. Parker soon became restless. He kept on seeing friends in the auditorium. We watched him, with his hat a little on the back of his head, going about shaking hands. "Barely 2 months," she replied. "Do look at father. Wherever he goes it's the same. The one recreation of his life is making friends. The people he is speaking to night he has probably come across in a railroad train or an American bar. He makes lifelong friends every time he drinks a cocktail, and he never forgets a face." "Isn't that a little trying for you?" I asked. She laughed outright. We talked for some time upon quite ordinary subjects. As the time passed on, however, and her father did not return, it seemed to me she became more silent. She told me very little about herself, and the few personal things she said were always restrained. I was beginning to feel almost discouraged. She sat so long, with a slight frown upon her forehead and her head turned away from me. "Miss Parker," I ventured at last, "something seems to have displeased you." "It has," she admitted. "Will you please tell me what it is?" I asked humbly. "If I have said or done anything clumsy, give me a chance, at any rate, to let you see how sorry I am." She turned and faced me then. "It is not your fault," she assured me. "Only I am a little annoyed with my father that he should have made your acquaintance. It isn't that at all, but I do not think he should have made use of you in the way he did. He is utterly reckless sometimes, and forgets what he is doing. It is all very well for himself, but he has no right to expose you to " "To what risk did he expose me?" I demanded. "Tell me, Miss Partley. Was I, then, an accomplice in anything illegal to night?" "Worse than illegal criminal," she told me. Now my father had been quickly and convincingly. "Then all I have to say about it is that I am glad," I declared. "Why?" she murmured, looking at me wonderingly. "Because he is your father and I have helped him," I answered under my breath. For a few moments she was silent. She looked at me, however, and as I watched her eyes grow softer I suddenly held out my hand, and for a moment she suffered hers to rest in it. Then she drew away a little. She was expression. "Mr. Walmsley," she said slowly, "I want to tell you I think you are making a mistake. Please listen to me carefully. You do not belong to the order of people from whom the adventurers of the world are drawn. What you are is written in your face. I am perfectly certain you possess the ordinary conventional ideas as to right and wrong, the ideas in which you have been brought up and which have been instilled into you all your life. My father and I belong to a different class of society. There is nothing to be gained for you by mixing with us, and a great deal to be lost." "May I not judge for myself?" I asked. "I fear," she answered, looking me full in the face and smiling at me delightfully, "you are just a little prejudiced." "Supposing," I whispered, "I have discovered something that seems to me better worth living for than anything else I have yet found in the world I know of, if that something belongs to a world in which I have not yet lived, do you blame me if for the sake of it I would be willing to climb down even into—" She held out her finger warningly. I heard heavy footsteps outside and the rattle of the door handle. "You are very foolish," she murmured. "Please let my father in," and declared that he had not had a dull moment. As for the performance, he seemed to have forgotten there was one going on at all. "I am for supper," he suggested. "I owe our friend here a supper in return for his interrupted dinner." "Supper, by all means," I agreed. "Remember that I am wearing a hat," Eve said. "We must go to one of the smaller places." In the end we went back to Stephano's. We sat at the table at which I had so often watched Eve and her father sitting alone, and by her side I listened to the music I had so often heard while I watched her from what had seemed to me to be an impossible distance. Mr. Parker talked wonderfully. He spoke of gigantic financial deals in Wall Street, of operations which had altered the policy of nations, of great robberies in New York, the details of which he discussed with amazing technical knowledge. He played tricks with the knives and forks, balanced the glasses in extraordinary fashion, and reduced our waiters to a state of numbed and amazed. All the time he was acknowledging and returning greetings, and all the time he talked. We spoke finally of gambling, and he laughed heartily when I made mild fun of the gambling scare that was just then being written up in all the papers and magazines. "So you don't believe in baccarat tables in London?" he said. "Very good. We shall see. After we have supped, we shall see." But Eve was subject at times to moods of either indifference or depression. The deprecate. She avoided meeting my eyes. More than once she glanced toward the clock. "Haven't you an appointment to night, father?" she asked, almost in an undertone. "Sure," Mr. Parker answered readily. "I have an appointment, and I am going to take you and Mr. Walmsley along." "I am delighted to hear it!" I exclaimed quickly. "I'll teach you to make fun of the newspapers," Mr. Parker went on. "No gambling hells in London, eh? Well, we shall see." To my great relief Eve made no spoken objection to my inclusion in the party. When at last we left, a large and handsome motor car was drawn up outside, waiting for us. A cab. I have to keep a car in order to slip about quietly. Now in what part of London shall we look for a gambling hell, Mr. Walmsley? I know of 11. Name your own street, somewhere in the West End. I named one at random. "The very place," Mr. Parker declared. "The very place where I have already an appointment. Get in. Say, you Londoners have no idea what goes on in your own city." We drove. "Then the lift will come down for you." He ascended and left us there. I turned at once to Eve, who had scarcely spoken a word during the drive from the restaurant. "I do wish you would tell me what is troubling you, Miss Parker," I begged. "If I am really in the way, of course you have only to say the word and I'll be off at once." She held my arm for a moment. The touch of her fingers gave me unreasonable pleasure. "Please don't think me rude or unkind," she pleaded. "Don't even think that I don't see father before supper. You don't belong. You ought not to be seen at these places, do you? It isn't a very good thing for you. It very likely won't be a good thing for us." "Do please change your opinion of me a little," I implored her. "I can't help my appearance, but let me assure you I am willing to play the Bohemian to any extent so long as I can be with you. There isn't a thing in your life I wouldn't be content to share, convinced, but against her will." "You are very obstinate," she declared. "But of course you're rather nice." After that I was ready for anything that might happen. The lift had descended and the porter bade us enter. We were standing, solid and imposing. He beckoned us, with a broad smile, to follow him. To my surprise there were no locked doors or burly doorkeepers. We hung up our things in the hall and passed into a long room, in which were some 15 or 20 people. Most of them were sitting round a chemin de fer table. A few were standing at the sideboard eating sandwiches. A dark haired, dark eyed, sallow faced man, a trifle corpulent, undeniably Semitic, who seemed to be in charge of her and your daughter, he said, glancing keenly at them both and then at me. "This gentleman is a friend of yours?" "Certainly," Mr. Parker replied. "I won't introduce you, but I'll answer for him." "You would like to play?" "I will play, certainly," Mr. Parker answered cheerfully. "My friend will watch for the present, at any rate." He waved us away, himself taking a seat at the table. I led Eve to a divan at the farther corner of the room. We sat there and watched the people. There were many whose faces I knew, a sprinkling of stockbrokers, one or two actresses, and half a dozen or so men about town of a dubious type. "Well, what is it?" she asked. "This is no sort of place for you, you know," I ventured. "Here it comes," she laughed. "The real, hide-bound, respectable Englishman. I tell you I like it. I like the life. I like the light and shade of it all. I should hate your stiff English country houses, your highly moral amusements, and your dull day by day life. Look at those people's faces as they bend over the table." "Well, I am looking at them," I told her. "I see nothing but greed. I see no face that has not already lost a great part of its attractiveness." "Perhaps," she replied indifferently. "I will grant you that greed is the keynote of this place. Yet even that has its interesting side. Where else do you see it so developed? Where else could you see the same emotion actuating a number of very different people in an altogether different manner?" "For an adventuress," I remarked, "you seem to notice things." "No one in the world, except those who live by adventures, ever has any inducement to notice things," she retorted. "That is why amateurs are such failures. One never does anything so well as when one does it for one's living." "The question is arguable," I submitted. She shrugged her shoulders. "Every question is arguable if it is worth while," she agreed carelessly. "Look at all those people coming in." "I don't understand it," I confessed. "These places are against the law, yet there seems to be no concealment at all. Why aren't we raided?" "Raids in this part of London only take place by arrangement," she assured me. "This place will reach its due date some time, but £100 a night, and it has been running for 2 months now. When the raid comes, Mr. Rubenstein I think that is his name can pay his £500 fine and move on somewhere else. It's wicked, the money they make here some nights." "You seem to know a good deal about it," I remarked. "The place interests father," she told me. "He comes here often." "And you?" "Sometimes. I am not always in the humor." I looked at her long and thoughtfully. Her beauty was entirely the beauty of a young girl. There were no signs of late hours or anxiety, and said, "Exactly what you mean when you call yourself an adventuress." She laughed. "It means this," she explained. "To night I have money in my purse, jewels on my fingers, a motor car to ride home in. In a week's time, if things went badly for us, I might have nothing. Then father or I, or both of us, would go out into the world to replenish, and from whomever had most of what we desired we should take as opportunity presented itself." "Irrespective of the law?" "Absolutely." "According to your standards, does not exist." I gave it up. She seemed thoroughly in earnest, and yet every word she spoke seemed contrary to my instinctive judgment of her. She pointed to the table. "Look," she whispered. "Look. There must be at least 1,000 or 1,500 pounds upon the table." It was just as she said these words that the thing happened. From somewhere among the little crowd of people gathered round the table there came the sound of heavy stamping on the floor, and in less than a moment every light in the room went out. The place was in somber darkness. Then, breaking the momentary silence, there came from outside a shrill whistle. Again there was a silence, and then pandemonium. In a dozen different keys one heard the same shout: "The police!" Eve gripped my arm. My match box was out in a moment and I struck a match, holding it high over my head. As it burned, a queer little halo of out. The banker was still sitting in his place. At first I seemed to have the idea that Mr. Parker was by his side. Then, to my astonishment, I saw his stentorian voice was heard from outside. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you please. Nothing has happened. The lights will be on again immediately." Almost as he spoke the place was flooded with light. The faces of the people were ghastly. A babel of voices arose. "Where are the police? Where are they? Who said the police?" The little dark gentleman, whose name was Rubenstein, stood upon a chair. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, "nothing whatever has happened. Nothing. The electric lights went out owing to an accident which I will investigate. No police here. Please take your places. The game will proceed." They came back a little reluctantly, as though still afraid. Then, suddenly, the banker's hoarse voice rang out through the room. All the time he had been sitting like an automaton. Now he was on his feet, swaying backward and forward, his eyes almost starting from his head. "Lock the doors! The bank has been robbed! The notes have gone! Mr. Rubenstein, don't let any one go out! I tell you there was £2,000 upon the table! Some one has the notes!" There was a little murmur of voices and a shriek from one of the women as she clutched her handbag. Mr. Parker, bland and benign, rose to his feet. "My own stake has disappeared," he declared, "and the pile of notes I distinctly saw in front of the banker has gone. I fear, Mr. Rubenstein, there is a thief among us." Mr. Rubenstein, white as a sheet, was standing at the door. He locked it and put the key in his pocket. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "play is over for to night. We are, without a doubt, the victims of an attempted robbery. The lights were turned out from the controlling switch by the lift man, who has disappeared. I will ask you to leave the room one by one, and, for all our sakes, I beg that any unknown to us will submit themselves to be searched." There was a little angry murmur. Mr. Rubenstein looked pleadingly round. "Ladies and gentlemen, £1,000 of my money has gone from that table, all the money I kept in reserve to make a bank for you. If any one will return it now, nothing shall be said. But to lose it," his forehead. He looked anxiously round, as though seeking for sympathy. Mr. Parker came over to his side. "Say, Mr. Rubenstein," he declared, "there isn't any one here who wants you to lose a £5 note. That's a sure thing. But there is just one difficulty about this searching business. How can you identify your note and bank notes in my pocket, which, let me hasten to assure you, I didn't? How could you deny it?" "My notes," Mr. Rubenstein replied feverishly, "all bear the stamp of Lloyd's Bank and to day's date. They can all be recognized, Rubenstein, to insist upon searching every person here not thoroughly known to you. And I recommend you, ladies and gentlemen," he added, looking round, "to submit to be searched. It will not be a very strenuous affair, because no one can have had time to conceal the notes very effectively. I think you will all agree with me that we cannot allow our friend, who has provided us with amusement for so many nights, to run the risk of a loss like this. Begin with me, Mr. Rubenstein. No, I insist upon it. You know me better than most of your clients, I think, but I submit myself voluntarily to be searched." "I thank you very much indeed, sir," Mr. Rubenstein declared quickly. "It is very good of you to set the example," he continued, thrusting his hand into "notes in this pocket 10, 20, 30. Not mine, I see. No Lloyd's stamp. Gold. A pleasant little handful of gold, that. Mr. Parker, I thank you, sir. If you will be so good as to pass into the next room." I brought Eve up. We were recognized as having been sitting upon the divan, and Mr. Rubenstein, with a bow and extended hand, motioned to us to pass on. "You will visit us again, I trust," he said, "when we are not so disturbed." "Most certainly," Mr. Parker promised in our names. "Most certainly, Mr. Rubenstein. We will all come again. Good night." "I'm not sure," Mr. Parker answered. "There is a matter of £800 in my right shoe, and a little more than that, I think, in my left. The note down my back was, I believe, £100 one. Quite a pleasant little evening and fairly remunerative. The lift man will cost me 100, but he was worth it." I sat for a moment, and I turned toward her, my cigarette case in my hand. "Parker," I added as I shook hands, "that you and your daughter will give me the great pleasure of dining with me any night this week. If there are any other little adventures about here in which I could take a hand, I can assure you I should be delighted. I might even be of some assistance." They both of them looked at me steadfastly. Then Eve ring up 3771A Gerrard to morrow morning between 10 and 11. Following morning my telephone bell rang and a visitor was announced. I did not that I recognized Mr. Cullen. In morning clothes, which consisted in his case of a blue serge suit that needed brushing and a bowler hat of extinct shape, he seemed to me, if possible, a little more objectionable than I had found him the previous night. He presented himself, however, in a wholly non-aggressive spirit, means, and that you belong to a highly esteemed county family. "And what of it, Mr. Cullen?" I asked. "This," he answered, "that I feel it my duty to mean Mr. and Miss Parker." "I mean Mr. and Miss Parker." "Are you making any definite charges against this young lady and gentleman?" I inquired after a moment's pause. "Very definite charges indeed," he replied. "I warn you, Mr. Walmsley, that this man and his daughter are in bad repute with us, and to be seen associated with him is to bring yourself under police surveillance. We had a special this Mr. Parker, as he calls himself, has been financing one of the greatest artists in banknote counterfeits ever known to the police. I am perfectly convinced that Mr. Parker left this young man in Adam Street last night with a packet of notes upon his person for which he had just paid £200, and if I could have arrested him then the game would have been up. He dodged me by going into the Cecil, leaving by the back way and coming through the Savoy, but I picked him up again within 2 minutes of his reaching Stephano's. Obviously with your collusion you'll pardon me, sir, but there the facts are he was seated at your table as though in the middle of a dinner. I had him searched, but there wasn't a thing on him. I'm not going to ask you what he did with the notes he had, whether he palmed them off on you or not, but I will simply say that between the time of his entering Stephano's and the time of my searching him he got rid of £1,000 worth of counterfeit notes." "Sounds very clever of him," I remarked. "How do you know that he didn't get rid of them to some one in either the Cecil or the Savoy?" "Because," Mr. Cullen explained, "he was followed by one of my men through both places and not lost sight of for a single second, but I had left a man in case he went the other way. I tell you he was under the strictest surveillance the whole time, except during the few minutes I might almost say seconds when he I am not inclined," Mr. Cullen continued slowly, "to mention specific " "Mr. Cullen," I said, "it is, of course, very kind of you to come to me in this "That dinner was a plant!" Mr. Cullen interrupted swiftly. "I knew it! Daughter. You understand? My suggestion is that you are mistaken. Until I shall continue to derive pleasure from their society." Mr. Cullen rose at once to his feet. "My warning has been given, sir," he said. It only politely, and showed him out. At 10:30 I rang up 37, apparently a servant. I inquired for Mr. Parker, and in a moment or two I heard "Sure," was the prompt reply. "My dear fellow, I am delighted to hear it. I was going to make a little suggestion to you for this evening, but my daughter here doesn't fall in with it. Leave round before then. You drop into Stephano's for dinner at about 7:30." He accentuated his words by beating on the palm of his left hand with 2 fingers of his right. "Most wonderful things ever put on paper. The marvellous thing is how, even for a "I did," I admitted. "They used to call him Angel Jake," Mr. Parker proceeded confidentially. "He was sentenced to death once for shooting a policeman, but there was some technicality he was tried in the wrong court, so he got off." I've interrupted. "Isn't everything a question of money? Say, what do you mean exactly? I'm not going to let go. I feel that if I do I may regret it all my life. I don't unduly depressed nor elated." He was obviously puzzled, however, one thumb in his waistcoat pocket and the other hand